Hello everybody, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I'm going to be talking to you about all of the books that I managed to read in June. So in terms of the actual amount of books that I managed to read, it wasn't the best month ever. I managed to read 6 books in total. A couple of them were quite chunky, but I definitely read a little bit more than I read in May. So we are on an upward trajectory, but we are not quite yet at my usual reading pace. We're just a little bit under. I also, of course, participated in Whateverthon throughout the month of June. I was a co-host for the Shelf Slayers team. Last I heard, Shelf Slayers were in the lead, but of course, as everyone's last minute points coming through, everything could change, so fingers crossed that we do manage to finish on top. But at the end of this video, after we've talked about all of the books, I will pop up the bingo board so you guys can see my progress in the readathon. I did complete everything apart from 2 prompts and I just ran out of time sadly, but I definitely had a great time participating. So getting into those stats, in June I read 6 books which added up to 2,681 pages and broke down to an average of 89 pages per day. 4-star rating, everything was actually pretty good in June. We had 1 3-star read and 5 4 stars, breaking down to an average of 3.8 per book, which is a little bit over average for me. For the demographics, every book that I read was adult this month. For the formats, I read 4 standardly formatted novels and I listened to 2 audiobooks. For the genres, we had 3 fantasy, 2 romance and 1 fantasy romance. And lastly, for the places where I sourced these books from, 3 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2022 and 3 of them I have hauled in 2022. So the first book that I read in the month was actually my 3-star read, which was You and Me on Vacation by Emily Henry. I really thought that I was going to love this and sadly I just didn't really get that into it. This one is an adult contemporary romance about 2 people who've been best friends for the last almost 15 years. They don't usually see each other very much throughout the year because they live in different cities when they get a little bit older and graduate college. Alex is more of a homebody and he lives in the town that they're actually both from, and Poppy's a little bit more outgoing and she lives in New York and is a travel journalist. But they have this tradition where every single year they go on a summer trip together and this is the time that they really dedicate to spending with each other. Firstly, it was because Poppy had a travel blog and now it's because she works for this travel company. However, when we start at this book, we know that the last summer trip that they took was actually 2 years ago and something happened during that trip which meant that they have just not contacted each other in the last 2 years, but as readers we don't know what that is. So this story follows the narrative of the last summer trip that they are going to take as they try and repair their friendship after whatever happened 2 summers ago, and then interspersed throughout there we have the rest of their summer trips throughout the years, starting with the one that they took longest to go. So ultimately I just didn't get that into this. They are friends, it's a friends to lovers story, and I do actually quite enjoy the way that this was established as we see the trips throughout the years in comparison to the most recent trip that they're taking. But I just didn't really see the chemistry between them very much, and also in terms of my attraction to the characters, Alex just wasn't really doing it for me. I didn't find him to be a compelling love interest. Towards the end I definitely started enjoying this book more, but throughout the first half I just wasn't really that into Alex and I wasn't really that into their romance. I've heard very hit and miss things about Emily Henry. Everybody seems to have one that they love and then the others they don't love quite so much. So even though I didn't adore You and Me on Vacation, I still do have hope for a couple of her other books. I've just been gifted one by one of my lovely patrons, Ash, who has just very kindly sent me book lovers, so thank you very much, Ash, and that one will of course be the next Emily Henry that I try. But I really thought this was the one with the synopsis that intrigued me the most, and I do love a friends to lovers story, but sadly this one just didn't really do it for me. I then spent most of my month reading the entire Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, so I'm not going to be holding these up the entire time that I talk about them, but I read Jade City, Jade War, and of course Jade Legacy. So this one is an adult urban fantasy series that is set on the island of Kacon. On Kacon, they mine jade, and the people of Kacon have the ability to harness the powers of jade. Now, the way that jade works very much reminded me of the powers in Mistborn. So the people who are tolerant to jade and able to harness it have abilities like enhanced speed, enhanced strength. They also have deflection and lightness, which means that they can jump really high and things like that. And because of how powerful jade can make you. It has become a symbol of status and power throughout this island especially, but also increasingly throughout the world. In this one, we are following one of the most powerful clans in K-Con, the No Peak clan, as they go to war with the Mountain clan for control of the Jade. In the first book, it kind of establishes a rivalry between the No Peak and the Mountain clan, and it starts with like small acts of aggression that could maybe be written off as something else, and then it builds and builds until it is pretty much unavoidable that these two clans are going to go to war. So there is a lot of politics in this series, which I really didn't expect. I expected this to be a little bit more action based with a little bit more of a standard fantasy plot line, but it's really a lot more strategic than I expected. We're mainly following the leaders of the No Peak clan, which is the Call family, and because they're at the top, it's a lot more like political maneuvering than it is actual groundwork. One of them, Hilo, who is my favorite character of the series, is more like military minded, and he is the Horn, which is essentially like the general of the clan. So we have a little bit more action in that regard, but with him being like the leader of the clan's military, even he has a lot more like strategizing and maneuvering than you would necessarily expect. So I gave every book in this series 4 stars, but I did increasingly enjoy them as we went on. So this one would be like your standard 4-star up until Jade Legacy, which was like very close to a 5. But the issue that I have with this series is that I don't really like the plot. It's a lot more political than I expected it to be, and the politics just keep expanding throughout the series to become more and more international and involving different countries around the world. So the first book mainly focuses on the clan politics, and then with every book it kind of expands a little bit more, and it's all about building power for the No Peak clan, which is done in a variety of ways. It's done through military and like winning territory in K-Con, but it's also through gaining more money. So like a specific instance that isn't really a spoiler that I can say about Jade Legacy is that they end up buying a movie studio and then getting it to the point where like they're making successful movies, and this will be like spoken about multiple times throughout the book, and it's relevant in that it contributes to the clan's status, but it's not especially thrilling to read about. So the plot was just very different than I expected it to be in this series. I will say that the writing style is kind of distant, so it doesn't necessarily lend itself to attachment to the characters. However, I did find that with every book that I read, I got more attached to the characters to the point where I really cared about the characters, and the plot was the thing that I enjoyed the least about it. I think we have amazing character growth in this series, and I have posted a non-spoiler vlog where I read this entire trilogy, and I've had a couple of comments about Hilo and his behavior towards a certain character at the end of Jade War that I haven't responded to yet, but I agree with those comments a lot. But I think that a lot of the characters throughout here, especially Hilo, show so much growth. The time that this series spans as well is like 26 years, so you really see all of the members of the Call family grow from being like in the mid-20s, one of them's 18 at the beginning, up until like their 40s and their 50s. And something that I really enjoyed is that you can see them maturing as characters, you can see them mellowing in some ways, you can see them learning from their mistakes in a lot of ways, and they are definitely flawed. Hilo especially, very flawed, very morally great character. And because this does span so much time as well, we spend so much time with them and see so many different facets of their life that it is hard not to become attached. Ultimately, this book just doesn't have a fantasy plotline. You could swap out the Jade for something like oil or coal, and the base of the story would pretty much be the same, which is what really threw me with this one. So while I did really enjoy it, while I'm really excited to read more from Fonda Lee, while I enjoyed the writing, adored the characters, this just really was very different to what I expected, and what it turned out to be was not something that I'm normally particularly drawn to. Like if you would have told me that this would have been like a mafia story with a tiny bit of fantasy before going into it, then I probably wouldn't have been as well. To be honest, I feel like I knew that. It's just with it being a fantasy, I didn't realize how much it is just like a kind of a mafia story with a little bit of fantasy, you know. Regardless, I'm really glad that I read this series, and Hilo lives in my mind rent-free. I'm still thinking about this series. It's been, I think, about a week now, and I'm still not quite over it. I then continued on with the Savage Land series and picked up Wildlands by Stacey Marie Brown, which this series is so addictive. After reading the first one, I think I had like 100 pages left after the first one, I ordered the sequel, and when I had 100 pages left of this, I ordered books 3 to 6 because I'm sick of wanting to carry on with this series when I get to the end and not having the next book. So we've resolved that now. All of them are on their way to me. So this one is an adult fantasy romance series set in Budapest after the Fae Wars. On one night when the main character was born, the veil between the world of the humans and the Fae fell, pretty much sending the world into chaos. So now the city is split in two, and we have the Savage Lands and the place where the Fae live, and then we also have a separate place where the humans live. So our main character in here is Brexley, and she is a human. She was the daughter of a general, and since her father passed away, she has been the ward of the king. She's grown up in the palace very close to the king and also very close to his son, the prince, who is her best friend, and she is also in love with him. Because she comes from a position of privilege, she tries to help out the poorer people in the world by stealing drugs from trains that transport them throughout the city and putting those drugs onto the black market so that the money is going to the hands of the lower classes as opposed to the elite. One day when she's doing this, she's actually caught and she's sent to this very well-known prison that no one ever escapes from. I gave this 4 stars. I loved it. I would say that this series is not especially critically good. Like, there are definitely a lot of flaws with the writing. It is very repetitive within the writing and also within the plot. Like, the first 2 books in this series are pretty much just main character gets captured or kidnapped by some kind of like organization or political group, spends a bit of time there, is rescued, repeat. But there's just something about these that are so addictive. This series definitely sells me on all of the love interests as well. At the beginning of this, I was eating up the friends to lovers scenario with the prince, and then, you know, I will say I think I know who the main love interest of this series is going to be. I'm like 99% sure, but I will say that there are quite a few of them. This girl is all over any attractive man that like crosses her path, but I'm pretty sure who the main love interest is, and it took me a while to warm to him, but by the end of the first book I was kind of sold, and then throughout the second one as well, I'm definitely feeling it. I will say that while there are fae in here, they are not the normal kind of fae. Like, they're not your pretty Sarah J Maas kind of fae, and I would also say that they're just generally not like typical fae. I think a lot of that has to do with the setting of this, because it does feel like quite a grimy, dark urban setting, and that doesn't especially lend itself to how I usually think of fairies, which is like tree palaces and underground courts and like pretty estates in the countryside or on top of mountains. This is also a pretty dark series. The second one wasn't quite as bad. In the first book in this series, we have content warnings for like sexual assault, graphic torture and violence. There's gun violence in here as well, also like substance abuse and like experimental drug trials and things like that. So do be wary of that if you are going into this series. But yeah, I don't have too much to actually say about this, aside from the fact that I'm just generally eating this series up and I cannot get enough of it. And then the final book that I read in June was just a little one to end the month, which was Supplicant by Sierra Simone. Oh my god. This was so dramatic, and I was living for it the entire way through. So this one is about a young woman called Charlotte who was going to marry her professor. She met him outside of university. She's American. She's living in London. She met him outside of university a week before classes start. Think like Ezra and Arya in Pretty Little Liars. And then when she got to college, she realized that he was actually one of her professors. Now, this didn't stop anything that they were doing, and they were set to be married, and he actually left her at the altar without any explanation. And she actually went to him, she confronted him, she asked him why, and he would not tell her. So that happened 4 years prior to the start of this. And since she was left at the altar, Charlie actually hasn't been doing too well, and she's had to drop out of university and work 2 jobs to be able to pay the bills and also support her brother. So one day when she's working her second job as a caterer, she meets the guy who left her at the altar, which is church, and before she knows it, she's sucked back into everything to do with him, and she's really like unable to help herself. So this has a lot of talk of religion in it, but from like an intellectual perspective. So it talks a lot about like religious iconography. The main male character, Church, who's a professor, is also an archaeologist, and that is also what the main character was going into before she dropped out of university. So they talk a lot about like historical artifacts, religious iconography, and it has like a little bit of an academia feel to it. A lot of this very short novella is set in a museum as well, and oh my god, just the drama. I will actually read you guys a sentence that I took a picture of. Her hands move back up to my chest, then my shoulders, then my hair, and I think this is it. This is the moment she's going to push me away and I won't get to taste her. I won't get to pour every hour of my emptiness and misery into the kinds of intimate kisses that I would rip my soul out to give her. I breathe in the sweet soap smelling warmth of her neck. I tell myself to enjoy this last moment of her body against mine, her hands in my hair, and I brace myself for the rejection I've earned, the rejection I deserve. There's also a bit where like she says she's about to expire because of some of the like sweet stuff going on, and I was just, honestly, I was just living for the drama in this, because not only is it written very dramatically in terms of like the choice of language, which, oh my god, very well written, very flowery, and I really enjoyed that, but also Church with like his self-sacrificing nature and the way that he's been pining for her all these years and she's been pining for him was also extremely dramatic, and I just loved it. The smut was pretty great as well. I'm really excited to read more from Sierra Simone now. The only other book that I have from her is Priest, but I am also of course interested in the Thornchapel series and possibly the new Camelot series, although I haven't heard as much about that one as I have about the others. But yeah, I don't usually love novellas. Really love this one, gave it 4 stars, and a great introduction to Sierra Simone. So there you have it. Those are the 6 books that I read in the month of June. As promised, I will put up the Whateverthon bingo board here so you can see like exactly what I used to fulfill each of the prompts. I'm hoping that I get to read a little bit more in July. My mental health, as you guys know, I've been struggling a lot the last couple of months and I'm still not 100%, like I'm really still not, but I do feel like I'm getting a little bit better as time goes on. It's just, it's turning out to be a little bit of a process, but I'm really hoping that I can read a little bit more in July, because mentally I want to read, like I want to curl up with a book and get lost in a story, but it's just really not happening for me at the moment, unfortunately. But down in the comments, please let me know if you've read any of the books that I've talked about today and what you guys thought about them. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram, and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.